The Guy Who Knew My Schedule by Girl Rediscovered. I moved from the city I used to live in to another town about 20 miles outside of it about 10 years ago. On Saturdays, it was recently becoming my habit to go wandering around the city, have lunch in what used to be my regular drinking spot, and then get a train home. Yesterday, I went into the city to see Deadpool 2. Afterwards, I wandered down to the bar and took my usual seat. I was somewhat later going in than usual. I ordered my food and a soft drink and a coffee, and I sat up on the dais with my back to the door and got out my Kindle and started reading. I've been coming here for over 20 years, so the regulars all know me. Anyway, this short, scruffy guy walks in and taps me on the arm and says hello. I reply and go back to my book. The two guys sitting at the next table looked up and watched this guy walk in. He walked the length of the bar, then stood by a wall and waited. The waitress brought me my meal and commented, "Is that someone you know?" I gently shook my head, and she walked back to the bar and picked up the phone. The strange guy is now looking at his watch. He comes back over to me and says, "Don't you normally go home by now?" I've got a mouthful of pizza, and one of the guys at the next table says something about me not needing permission to be out late. The strange man walks out, but hides just around the corner of the door. By the time I'm finished eating, the pub's doorman walks in, earlier than he usually starts. He looks at me and says, "Don't move." The waitress brings me over the coffee, and as I started to say thanks, she said the coffee is on her because strange guy is still hiding around the corner. Doorman goes up to the strange guy and tells him to move on, then tells me to stay until he's sure the guy is gone. 20 minutes later, I have to get up to go because it's getting late and the trains get really irregular. A biker guy from the next table walked me across the road to the station and put me on the train. Just after he leaves, strange guy runs onto my train and sits 2 rows in front of me. At this point, a gang of football fans get on, celebrating after a match. One of them sees strange guy watching me and dives into the seat next to me. "Hello, baby. So glad I caught you on the way home. What do you reckon to grabbing a takeaway on the way home?" He pulled me close like we are snogging and says, "I'm an off-duty cop. I don't like the look of that guy. Where are you getting off?" I whispered my stop into his ear and we continued to fake cuddle and giggle. Strange guy is raging at this point and got off at the next stop. The cop stayed on the train with me and even walked me home. I did talk to his wife on the phone and backed up his explanation of why he was being late home and congratulated her on having such a great husband. Cop recommended I put in a complaint to the police, but I think I'll just change my routine for a few weeks until strange guy gets bored. So, strange guy in Glasgow? Let's not meet. Celtic supporting policeman and his wife, waitresses and bikers, thank you all. Drowning Lady by Paulette B. This is a story related to me by a close personal friend, and judging by her character, I know it's true. Kathy, her husband, and another couple were spending the weekend camping at a secluded spot on the Clinch River. The other 3 had left camp earlier, intent on catching fish for supper, traveling about a mile down the river to a special spot excellent for fishing. Alone at the camp, Kathy decided to enjoy her privacy by bathing in the river. Finding a hidden spot below the camp, soap in hand, she waded out into the river to a spot of waist-deep water, about halfway across the stream. There she began her bathing rituals. As she enjoyed the cool water, she was suddenly startled by the sound of a large splash a short distance away, as though someone had fallen or dove into the water. Thinking her privacy had been invaded by an unexpected swimmer, she searched the area the sound came from, and along the riverbank for signs of whoever it might be. There was no one in sight, either on the bank or in the water. She returned to her bath. Suddenly, her attention was caught by movement on a high rock ledge protruding into the water a short distance away. To her shock, a woman clothed in a long flowing gown, her long hair swaying in the breeze, stood there. The surrounding scenery had magically changed. Where the lady stood, suspended on the edge of the rock, was surrounded by empty blue sky, not the tree-lined embankments that should be in view. The water itself had also changed from the dark color of the river to a clear crystal blue. Seaweed swayed at its depth amidst coral formations. As Kathy stood there frozen in shock, the woman began to fall, feet first, into the water below. Time seemed to slow as Kathy watched the woman sink beneath the water, her hair spreading out around her as she descended. Tiny bubbles arose around her as she sank slowly to the bottom and from sight, among the seaweed growing there. The woman did not struggle as she sank slowly into the watery depths, and as she disappeared from view, time seemed to return to a normal pace, and Kathy was released from her trance-like state. The ocean view had vanished, and no sign of the woman was seen. The entire episode had a dreamlike quality. Shaken, Kathy exited the river, returned to camp, and zipped herself in her tent to await the return of her husband and friends. Some time later, the fishing party returned to find a shaken Kathy visibly upset by what she had witnessed. As she told her story, the men grew quiet. Then, as she finished her description of the woman and her plunge into the water, her husband chuckled quietly. Thinking that he had lost his mind to laugh at such a story, she asked him what could possibly be funny about what she had witnessed. Putting his arm around her, he said, "Honey, you just saw a ghost. That woman died years ago. In fact, they buried her right over there in that old fence row." Even more shaken than before and somewhat disbelieving, Kathy pressed for details. It seems that, in the early 1920s, a woman's body was found along the riverbank near where Kathy had sighted the woman fall into the water. She was never identified, and since no one claimed her body, she had been buried by the owner of the land along this particular section of river, in the old fence row, in an unmarked grave. The law, being very lax in the area at the time the lady was found, made no investigation that proved fruitful, in either determining who she was or how her drowned body had gotten there. The mystery was never solved, and her spirit is apparently not at rest. Many different people have witnessed exactly what Kathy had seen, a lady falling to her death in the water below. Did she fall, or was it suicide? And what of the ocean view around the ethereal form? Could she have died somewhere far away and her body have been transported to lie in the murky waters of the Clinch River? Perhaps we'll never know, but let us hope that her restless spirit will soon find peace. Not the Words of a Rational Mind by Opinionated IMO. He started out by telling me little things about himself. Just random tidbits, ordinary by any barometer. The old man sitting beside me in the car dealership waiting room just wanted to chat. I got the feeling it was cathartic for him to share his miscellaneous wit and wisdom. He seemed harmless enough. I even smiled in modest encouragement. It seemed like the polite thing to do. The customer lounge was filled with the same old boring magazines as every other car waiting room in the world. As an extrovert, I don't mind hearing this voluntary confession from this man. It was bound to be more interesting than a 3-year-old dog-eared copy of Road and Driver. The old man had a matter-of-fact conspiratorial air about him. Frankly, it made me feel a little uneasy, but I thought I was imagining things. He spoke as if we'd been friends for 30 years, yet I've never met him before. His eyes remained wide open, and he rarely blinked. Each of his new white-knuckled admissions submerged me into another level of his very disturbing personal life. What started out as a run-of-the-mill bland set of his daily occurrences rapidly devolved into a series of diabolical tales. I tried to maintain the pretense of neutrality in my expressions, but the act was largely unnecessary. The old man would have unloaded his jaw-dropping bombshells to Bozo the clown. He kept dishing out his unbelievable stories in rapid-fire succession. My participation level was minimal and counterproductive. If I dared to request clarification, the interruption distracted him, and finally I learned to just shut up and listen. Like a train wreck, the details were horrifying, but I couldn't seem to look away from the visceral carnage. He explained early on in the gripping saga that his former spouse was a prostitute. At the time he accepted how she earned her money, but he couldn't bear to witness it in person. Their household rule was that she had to have all business conducted and completed while he was away at work. One day, an appointment ran long, and he walked in on his wife servicing a customer. His eyes grew wide with menace as he described the fury in his heart, his voice growing noticeably louder. It was chock full of raw emotion, and the entire waiting room was in rapt attention as we waited breathlessly as he described what happened next. The old man mentioned that he was a carpenter by trade. As is often the case in crimes of passion, he selected an instrument of vengeance that he was intimately familiar with. He grabbed a hammer and proceeded to batter the John's cranium with a series of death blows. He described copious amounts of blood flying with each furious swing. Try to imagine the stunned reaction of hearing this pulse-pounding story by a roomful of startled housewives waiting for an oil change. The hair on my neck stood on end. And the old man seemed kind of oblivious to how this tale was affecting anybody around him. He was reliving the moment. He was right back there. In his mind, he was still swinging that bloody hammer. He'd actually stood up near the end and was vigorously pantomiming the story. I didn't doubt the truth of his tale for a moment, but anyone admitting to attempted murder would surely be in prison, right? And here he was, a free man, regaling his homicidal frenzy to a room of captivated folks at a local Ford dealership. I asked him what happened next. I was terrified he was going to say that he buried the body in his backyard to cover up his crime. Instead, he explained that he was found unfit to stand trial and institutionalized. After a series of psychotropic meds and years of shock therapy, he was eventually released on his own recognizance. In the antithesis of storytelling, the service manager walked in and interrupted. The guy's vehicle was ready, thus ending his terrifying testimonial. The little old man said goodbye, paid his bill, and left. His words gripped and entertained us until the very end, but they were not those of a rational man. Somehow, I feel a little less safe that he is a free man among us. Bobcat Woman by Skierboy7. I'm a wildland firefighter with the Forest Service. This isn't my story, but it's from a supervisor of mine that I believe completely. The setting was 2004 or so, the Hell's Canyon area of Middle Idaho. My supervisor's crew had been working all day on an emerging incident, and were going to be working through the night as well. Being the assistant superintendent of the crew, which is second in charge effectively, he was out ahead scouting on an ATV. He was working his way down a logging road that clearly had not been used in some time, when a bobcat or a lynx, it's been a while since I've heard this, appeared in the middle of the road, but didn't run away as they usually would. The thing just stood there for a good 10 seconds, screamed at him, and then scampered up a tree 5 feet off the road. He found that odd, but not particularly unsettling. Just a half mile or so down the road, he found a small cabin. Also odd, as this is federal land and no private structure should have been there. Upon investigation, all the windows had been boarded shut tight, and someone had done a good job of doing so. The doorknob had been punched out and secured to a hole drilled into the log frame by a chain. Someone did not want anything getting in or out. Peering through a hole in the door, he could see that everything in the house was upset. That kind of had him unsettled, so he hopped on his ATV and headed back up the road. Well, here's where it gets interesting. Right where the bobcat had been there was now standing a Native American woman in a badly tattered nightgown and bare feet. Just standing there. He yelled to her, asking if she needed help. She just screamed at him. The same scream as the cat before. And then she climbed right up the tree, faster than any human has a right to be climbing. Obviously, he noped out of there as fast as he could. Unsure of what or who he had just seen, he started asking around a little bit, and a local Native American heard him talking and informed him that what he saw was a pumawa. In effect, a skin changer, a warg. Now, I would not believe most people that tried to tell me that, but this was a serious man that did not fuck around about many things. He was dead serious the 2 times I've heard him tell that tale, and I 100% believe he saw what he saw. Where Do You Think You're Going? By Not Your Anthem. Going into college, I was pretty naive about the way of the world and way too trusting of strangers. This led to some interesting situations, but one of the scariest encounters I've ever had, even to this day, occurred in February of my freshman year. A little background. My freshman year, I lived in a dorm on a floor full of girls. We were all friends, and if one of us got invited to a house party, frat party, or whatever, all of us would tag along. I didn't know a single person coming into college, and I really wanted to make friends, so I just tried to go with the flow. While I've never been a big drinker, I just don't like the taste, this was not a problem for the other girls. They went hard. It was kind of impressive, actually. Anyway, on this particular February weekend, I can't remember if it was a Friday or Saturday night, I was coming down with a bad cold. I was walking back to my room after grabbing some food from the dining hall, and right as I got to my floor, one of the girls told me there was a house party going on that night on Weston Street. Weston Street was less than a 15-minute walk from our dorm, and a lot of upperclassmen lived there. The parties were always wild, and being invited to one was a big deal for freshman girls, or so we thought at the time. I told my floor mates I wasn't really in the mood to go out, but they convinced me it would be fun, and if I got there and really just wanted to head back to the dorm, we'd leave. So as it gets darker and 9 o'clock rolls around, our floor starts to pregame for the next few hours. I only had a few beers, nothing excessive, but by the time we finally left at 11, most of us were pretty drunk. It's important to note that there had been a slew of sexual assaults reported at my school around this time, and the university was advising students to travel in groups. There were about 20 of us or so walking to this party, and I really didn't think anything more about it at the time. When we finally got there, it was super crowded, like you couldn't stand anywhere without brushing up against someone. And it was definitely not a fun type of party if you're sober, and I was. I chugged a few mixed drinks, got a pretty good buzz going, and tried to be social and hang out with my friends, but I was starting to feel pretty bad from my cold, and honestly, I was really sick of people bumping into me and spilling their drinks. All I wanted to do was find someone to walk back with me to the dorm, so I could pop some Advil PM and go to sleep. I looked around and spotted Lauren by the archway to the kitchen. She was one of my floor mates. I asked her if she'd be willing to head back to the dorm with me, to which she replied that her booty call was there and she was trying to bang him. I continued searching for my other friends, and their stories are pretty much all the same. Too drunk, hooking up, having fun, etc. I finally found someone willing to walk with me, and I felt a wave of relief. I really didn't want to walk back alone, and this area wasn't well lit. We left the party and began the tedious uphill walk back to the dorm. It was midnight, 10 degrees out, and I went to college in a state filled with mountains, so the campus is full of steep hills. As we were walking back, Katie, the girl who I was walking with, spotted a few of her sorority sisters driving by, and they asked her if she wanted to go to another party with them. I was like, "Katie, you said you'd walk back with me," to which she replied, "Yeah, but it's like a 10-minute walk from here. Nothing's going to happen. You'll be fine." I asked if I could at least get a ride back from her friends, but they told me the car was full and drove off with Katie. So now I'm on this dimly lit sidewalk by myself, and in my head I'm thinking, well, isn't this freaking great? So I started to head back alone, and at first I was a little freaked out because I've never walked home by myself before, and I was thinking about those assault stories. But I passed a few people and no one said anything, so I began to relax a little bit. They were just stories. Nothing was going to happen. I came upon a really well-lit part of campus, and I was happy. In my mind, I thought if I was in a location that was really well-lit, I was 100% safe. Again, freshman naivete. As I was coming up on this well-lit intersection, the kind where there's 4 crosswalks, so a square is essentially formed, I noticed a group of 8 or 10 guys on the other side of the sidewalk parallel to me walking in the opposite direction. I was walking uphill. They were walking down. They looked like the stereotypical douchebag frat boy jock guys, and were being boisterous. I kept my head down, kept walking, and didn't think anything of them until I heard, "Look, boys, there's a hot one." They all started calling out phrases and catcalls. "Hey, baby, what are you doing all alone out here by yourself? You need a man to warm you up?" "Sexy mama." "Hey, cutie, come over here for a minute." You get the picture. My danger alarms were going off in my head, but I told myself that it was fine, and if I just kept walking and ignored them, they would lose interest. As I continued to walk up the hill, I noticed that they now changed direction and were walking the same way I was. I didn't say a word to them up until this point, and it was starting to piss them off. I was now by the crosswalk of the intersection, but I can't walk across the way I need to because then I'd have to pass them directly. I look around for someone, anyone, to help me, but there's literally not a soul in sight. It's just me and them. At this point, I was starting to panic, and I was running through my options in my head. Could I call someone? Everyone I know either is out partying or won't pick up or are asleep. Call the police? Yes, but would they get here fast enough? It was also at the point I noticed they started to walk across the street towards me. I can still remember the look on one of the guys' faces as he marched across the intersection and yelled, "Hey, bitch! We're talking to you! Where the fuck do you think you're going?" I kid you not. My limbs felt like jelly. I guess my brain went into autopilot mode, though, because as these guys were walking towards me, I ran across the crosswalk to my left. It didn't really make any sense, but I was just trying to get away from them at that point. And then crossed the next crosswalk so that we were all now diagonal from each other. And I heard one of the guys say, "You know what? I'm sick of this shit. You, go get her." And 2 guys started sprinting towards me. You know that feeling where you're on a roller coaster and when you go down the first hill your stomach drops? That's exactly how I felt. I couldn't believe it. I took off running as fast as I could, and if someone clocked my speed, I'm sure they'd tell me I broke my school's 400-meter dash record. I literally ran all the way back to my dorm, and I didn't look back until I was at the main entrance. By the grace of God, they didn't catch me, and I'm not sure when they stopped chasing me, but I didn't care. Even as I type this, I still get chills thinking about it. If they had caught me, who knows what they would have done. I'm not a very strong girl. They could have knocked me out and told someone passing by I was their drunk sister, or girlfriend, or friend, whatever, who had just passed out and they were taking me home. It could have ended very badly for me. When I got into my dorm room, I sank to the floor and cried. I didn't sleep that night, and I've never walked home alone again. I'm sure it goes without saying, but psycho, rapey college guys, let's not meet again. Strange Creatures at a Canadian Resort by Bluegrass M. A bit of backstory before I start this. I live in northern British Columbia, Canada, and a couple of years back, my friend had invited me to come with him, his mom, and his sister to a resort by a lake about an hour and a half or so out of town. This was at the end of June and the beginning of July. I put resort in quotations because it's a main log building where you check in and out, and it also has a restaurant. There's a few log cabins and some spots down by the lake for RVs and stuff to park in. There's a highway that you turn off of to let you onto the lot where the check-in building is, and to the right of the highway is forest for miles as well as everywhere else around that area. The only thing that stands out is the highway, which cuts through the woods. Around the lake there's some houses and whatnot, but generally speaking, if it's not a long weekend, there aren't too many people out there. The cabins and RV area is separate, and the main building is about a 5 or 8 minute walk away from the cabins up a spiral road. A little past the main building, there's a clearing where you can sit at a couple of tables that look like they haven't been sat in for 10 years, as there's vines and grass that have grown around and on them. About 50 feet into the woods past those tables are 2 small lagoons surrounded by an old wire fence. I'll talk about why the lagoons and the table are important later. We got there in the early evening, unloaded the car, and got acquainted with the log cabin, which is really nice, by the way. And then we went out to explore around. Not too much interesting stuff happened on that first day, as we didn't explore a whole lot before dark. Skip to the next day, and it was cloudy and rainy, which we actually were hoping for, as that meant that there were very few people at the resort, and we'd get free reign over it. We explored down by the lake and around the cabin areas more thoroughly, and eventually made our way up to the clearing where the tables were. We looked at the tables and saw why they hadn't been touched in what looked like a long time from the amount of grass and weeds that I mentioned, and while investigating, I took some notice that around 50 feet or so back in the woods, there was what looked to be a clear area. We slid down into this ditch-like area, which was probably around an 8-foot difference in elevation from the table area, and we started tramping through the brush. We eventually came to the spot, which we were pretty sure are lagoons due to the way they're constructed, and noticed there was a wire fence around it. We walked around the area planning to leave, until we saw what looked like a spot where a large animal had walked over the fence and crushed a portion of it. Not really paying attention to the fact that a large animal may have been in the area, we dismissed those thoughts and said it was probably bent like this for a long time. We tooled around the area looking at the lagoons, and eventually we left as it was getting time to eat dinner. We planned to come back the next day with some big rocks to throw in. The next day we came back to the tables planning to go to that area, but before we had a chance to go down the ditch, we stopped because of a noise. This is what triggered the rest of the events in this story. The noises we heard were those of something walking over small twigs, snapping them in the lagoon ditch area where we had just traveled. Keep in mind, there weren't footsteps there the day before. We stuck around for about 10 minutes or so until we got hit with an intense feeling of dread. We said screw this and went back to our cabin where we played poker for the rest of the evening. While playing, we discussed the events that had taken place and eventually laughed it off, just saying it was probably a bear passing through or maybe some rabbits. The next day, it was raining heavily and much darker than the past couple of days. We left the cabin and planned to go to the lagoon area later, but we wanted to chill around a medium forested area close to the cabins that I forgot to mention in the beginning of the story. As I previously said, after we had originally gone to the lagoon area, things started getting weird. Now we were messing around in these other woods, breaking big sticks on trees, when we heard what sounded to be someone else doing the same thing, about 200 feet away, the direction we were facing. It was hard to judge how far exactly it was because of the way the forest carries sound, but it was pretty far in front of us. We didn't care too much about this until we took notice of where it actually was. The entire area around there and beyond is all forested, and having someone in those forests along with us that far in less than favorable weather, and again with very few people at the resort at that time, was unlikely. We decided to leave the area and come back later during the evening. Spoiler alert, that was not a good idea. So after leaving the area, we went around to the lagoon and listened for a couple of minutes. We couldn't hear any walking, so we assumed that we were right about it being a passing forest creature. Not even 10 steps in, I told my friend to stop moving. We both stopped and listened. We heard what sounded to be the steps again, but they were coming in louder and faster. We got the same overbearing feeling of dread. We hightailed it out of there, spooked as hell, and we booked it back to our cabin. Later that evening, we returned to the forest clearing earlier where we had heard the branch breaking against a tree noise earlier in the day. We again started smacking branches against the trees, this time not hearing anything. But as I turned to my left, something caught my eye. There was what appeared to be a person standing behind a tree, and I saw them duck behind it when they noticed I had noticed them. I nearly shit myself as I yelled to my friend that we needed to get out of here, and we sprinted back to the cabin. We returned the next day, and I took a picture of where the figure was standing. Later that night, while we were sitting in the loft area where our beds were, we had a discussion about what happened that day. It was much less joking this time, and we were trying to make sense of it all. We started with the branch hitting the tree noise, and at first we tried to dismiss it by saying that it was an echo, but remembered that the echoes weren't prominent at the time, especially 5 seconds after hitting the tree. And only I was the one who saw the figure in the same area later. But I knew it was a person, or at least I think it was a person. We weren't too sure about that, so we moved on to talking about the lagoon and table area. Nothing really too interesting came up in that conversation. We left the next day as our booking had ended, and this is not the end of the story. We came back last year around the same time, end of June, beginning of July, but we had brought another friend with us this time. We showed him around and briefed him about what had happened the previous year, and he took it with a grain of salt, as any sane person would do. This eventually changed over the next 3 days. The activity this time around wasn't as much in the side forest where I saw the figure and where me and my friend had heard the tree noises, although we did hear the returning knocks again. But these sounds and things happened in the lagoon table area. After showing our friend the lagoon, we decided to enter it after not hearing any noises. All went well, and we returned the next day. This time, the footsteps were there once again, but a bit closer than before. We left that area, but returned about an hour later, and we were determined to see what was repelling us out of there. But to get in, we figured we had to be quieter. Slowly, we went down the ditch and to the lagoons without anything hearing us. We didn't see anything there. We heard something snap a little bit away, so without making too much noise, we got out of there. The next and final day before we had to leave once again, we went back to that area, but when we were at the table, we heard something new. It was a sort of screeching noise, but it sounded like a person almost. At first, we did think it was a person who had injured themselves and was calling for help, but I made everyone stop and just listen before we did anything. We listened to it, and from what I heard, it sounded like a mixture between a person yelling and an angry cat hissing and a shallow dog barking all at once. My friends decided that they wanted to get closer and investigate the sound, and I was opposed to it. We went anyway, but I stayed much further away as my gut was telling me to get out of there. We threw rocks from the area where the sound was coming from, hoping to flush it out of its hiding spot. And when that didn't work, we got much too close. We were right at the edge of the ditch, and when I got as close as my friends did, the thing that was making the sound had either thrown a large log or had knocked down a tree, judging by the sound, but I didn't exactly stick around to investigate. I turned tail and bolted as fast as my legs would carry me. I was probably 15 yards ahead of my friends, as my danger reflexes were faster coming to me, and it registered to me that I needed to get the hell out of there quicker than it did to them. We were about 100 feet away when we came to a stop. Nothing came after us, but the sounds resumed. We walked around the main building, and when we came around, there was a black bear standing there. We let out a sigh of relief as we thought we had been spooked by a bear, but then shifted back to our previous feeling of dread when the bear did the same as us. We got out of there, and he did too, both as fast as we could. We didn't investigate any further and ran back to our cabin. Nothing further happened as we left the following day due to the reservation being over again. I might be going back this year as it's approaching the same time, and that's why I'm writing this. I wanted to get out what I have so far, and if I go again this year, I'll update everyone about my experiences. I don't know what the lagoon table creature is, but I sure as hell know it isn't any bear. The other thing in the forest I'm still not sure about. I think that they're separate things, as the woodsman or tree knocker, as we've nicknamed it, is more elusive and seems to be luring us into that area, while the screecher is very territorial and aggressive. I've tried to find things online about a similar experience in that area, but I've come up empty, which is another reason why I'm posting this. Does anybody have any ideas about what these things are or could be? I have no clue what's going on there. Disappearing Car by Anonymous. I'm a senior chemical engineer at a well-known northeastern U.S. university. I have a story to tell about the first time I ever saw a ghost. This is not a joke, and I'm not making this up. I've always been interested in ghosts, but I had never seen one before this. At the time, I was delivering pizzas for Domino's Pizza in Utica, New York, when it happened. I was coming back to the store after a delivery, and I was on the off-ramp. There's a light at the end of the off-ramp and a 4-lane split highway that connects to it. From the light, you can go straight across and turn left onto one side, or you can turn right onto the near side of the highway. I was pulled up at the light, and all of a sudden there was a bright light in my back window. It was the headlights of a car, and he appeared to have come off the other highway behind me and pulled right up behind me so close that I couldn't see the headlights anymore. I was wondering what the heck he was doing getting so close to me, and then all of a sudden, he was next to me. It took him the time from when I was looking in the rearview mirror at the car to when I looked forward at the light and then looked sideways to move up next to me. That, in and of itself, was supernatural, since he had been so close to the back of me, he couldn't have just pulled up next to me from where he was, especially in that amount of time. So I looked over at him, and he was looking at me. It was about the freakiest thing I had ever seen. He was glowing, it seemed, and he was staring at me with this dreamy smirk on his face. I could see the rest of his car right through him. He was transparent. So I kept looking at him, and he looked at me. Then the light changed, and I started driving forward. I was in the leftmost lane, which was the left turn lane. He was in the middle lane, which was also a left turn lane. So when I took off, I figured he would still be next to me. But when I looked back over, he wasn't there. Being curious and figuring he must have turned right instead, I looked back down the road where he should have been, and no one was there. The car had simply vanished. This is a very open area, and if he had pulled off the road, I would have seen him. There is nowhere he could have gone where I wouldn't have seen him. I've tried every single line of reasoning I can think of as to where he could have possibly gone, and there was no other answer other than he and his car just disappeared. This is completely true how I experienced it. Has anyone else heard of something like this? I keep thinking that maybe it was the ghost of someone killed at that intersection in an accident or something, but I'm not sure where I could find out about the history of the intersection. So, that's my story. Believe it or don't. Daffodil House by Mary. Call me crazy. Hey, everyone else does, so why not my spooky friends too? But as a teen, my friends and I loved exploring abandoned properties. There was a house just outside of town, about a half-mile off the highway, that had intrigued me since childhood, and I had to go see it. One afternoon, 2 of my friends agreed that it would be a great place to check out, so we loaded up and went. It was a typical creepy old farmhouse type place, made of wood that had begun to rot decades ago. Dirty, mostly broken windows, rickety porch, 2 stories high plus an attic. Getting in was no problem. The doors were gone, so we just walked on in. There was evidence of other people having been there, as the room we concluded to be the living room was full of empty beer cans and potato chip bags. Uninterested in these findings, we made our way into the kitchen. It was broad daylight outside, but this house was pretty dark inside, adding to the intrigue and creepiness. The kitchen was a wreck and seemed as though the mice had taken full advantage of whatever had been left there, so on to the dining room. Finally, we saw a set of stairs, and the first ones we had seen so far, so up we went. On the 3rd step from the top, I set my soda can down so we'd be able to remember that's where we came up, and I'm glad I had the foresight to do that. We meandered to the top floor and found that it was much brighter and warmer up there, and possibly because it wasn't under the cover of the low tree branches, as the downstairs had been. We weren't feeling too afraid, just a little uneasy as we walked around until we got to a large room on the east side. I can't really explain what I felt. Mostly I felt as though I wanted to cry. Someone was very sad, and that much I could feel. Whoever it was hadn't been ready to die when they did, and weren't able to say goodbye and let go. My friend Chris left the room, stating that he was finding it difficult to breathe, and that must be the dust bothering him. My friend Megan was very pale and shaking, so we decided, okay, it's time to go. We walked around the top floor looking for stairs to the attic and never found them. We found a set going down which we had missed on the first few go-rounds, so down we went. And they led to the living room. Wait, how was that possible? We walked around the downstairs, peeking in all the little doors for stairs, only to find closets. There wasn't a door to get out of the living room, so we went back upstairs and walked around some more. And finally, Megan spotted the stairs where my soda can was, and we happily bounded down them and back into the dining room. We made our way around the downstairs again just to be sure. The dining room led to the back porch and the kitchen and had stairs to go up. The kitchen only led to the dining room and the living room. And the living room only led to the kitchen and the porches. Okay, so where were the stairs we walked down? This was the same room because the mess on the floor was the same and the mantel above the fireplace was the same. So what was the deal here? We went back upstairs, and Megan stayed at the top of them while Chris and I walked around again in search of the mystery steps we had gone down. We never found them. As Chris and I were walking back towards Megan, I heard someone in the large bedroom that made me feel sad again. It sounded like a soft crying, and I felt very bad. I also felt that we had intruded on this person's life. Well, okay, afterlife. And that, finally, it was time to leave. So we did. Most places we ever visited, we went back for a second and sometimes third look. However, with this place, we didn't. We all felt after we had left that maybe whoever was there really just wanted to be left alone. And we never went back together. The very odd thing is that on Easter Day of the following year, I had this unstoppable urge to go to the house and leave flowers on the porch. I got some daffodils and headed out there only to find my friends Chris and Megan had also come to bring flowers. We had all had an urge, and we had all headed out there without the others knowing, and we all had a big bouquet of fresh daffodils. Something there had touched each of us, and we will forever feel a connection to the house in the woods, and whomever it is that lives in the large room on the east side of the upper floor, who seems to like daffodils. The Men Outside, submitted by Annie. When I was growing up in the 50s in a little town called Hopkinton, Rhode Island, we had one scare that affected me and my friend Susie. We were best of friends, but in this little town she lived a ways away from me, so when we were little we only saw each other at school and on weekends. There wasn't really much to our town, and I lived near a church that I think was later turned into a town hall or it's now some preservation group. I haven't been back there since the late 60s, and I don't know anyone there at all. When Susie and I did get together, we had a lot of fun playing in the woods and in the creek that ran through town. I haven't thought about this in a long time, but my daughter told me that she listens to your show, and after listening to it, I remembered a scary time back around 1960. Susie and I must have been 9 or 10 when this happened. She was staying with my family one weekend in the summer, and we had been splashing around in the creek looking for salamanders and such. After a while, Susie nudged me and then pointed over to a tent or something on the other side of the water up a little bit. She said we should go over and check it out, and that's what we did. When we got closer to it, we could smell something bad. It's been so many years, but I remember like it was rotting meat or that sort of thing, just stinky, like body odor and sweat. We crept up to the tent wondering where it had come from and who it belonged to, as this didn't seem like anyone we knew from our tiny, tiny town. Older boys camped out all the time doing their Boy Scout things, but we knew most of them, even the older ones. Susie was always braver than me, and she picked up a stick and stuck it into the door flap of the tent and pushed it up a little bit. We saw a boot and jumped back a bit. There was someone in there. That's when we heard a voice behind us say, "You little girls, get away from there!" We nearly fell over scared out of our minds and turned to see a really scruffy-looking man standing near the woods a little ways away from us. He looked scary then, and he's still scary in my mind. He had a stained white shirt and looked like he hadn't shaved for weeks, but wasn't growing a beard. It was just gross looking. We both let out a little squeak like frightened girls do, and the man started walking towards us, saying, "Come here." I didn't want to, but we had also been raised to listen to our elders, so we just stood there being scared as he walked towards us. Just then I felt something on my foot, and I looked down and screamed as I saw a hand grabbing at my foot. Another man had come out of the tent, so there was another one in there. I jumped up, and my little shoe and sock came off in his hand, and I don't even remember looking at him as I started running away, telling Susie to come on. We slid down the bank into the creek and splashed ourselves away from the men. I looked back for 1 second and tripped, just like in the spooky movies. I looked up to see the men going down the bank and coming into the creek after us. I got up soaked, looking like a wet cat, and kept running with Susie, who was now way ahead of me. We ran and ran up out of the creek and into the woods that would lead us up to the church that I mentioned. My ankle was hurting me a lot, but we kept going, every once in a while hearing the men yell for us to get back there. Susie and I got to the road and to the church, but the front doors were locked, so we ran around the side. That door was locked too. "Should we just go to your house?" Susie asked, but I told her my ankle was hurt and I needed to sit down. She spied a window to the basement that was open and said we could hide there until we thought the men went away. We slipped in and dropped down to the dirt floor, and then we crawled to the other side of the basement, away from the windows and into the dark. It was dark and cold and wet down there, and it smelled funny like dirt basements do. There were 3 sets of windows on each side of the basement, and it didn't take long before we saw legs and feet moving slowly along them. We held our breath as the 2 men stopped at the open window. And they stood there for a while talking, but we couldn't hear them. And then they finally went away, thank goodness. We waited there in the dark for another half hour before we went over to a staircase that led up, hoping the door would be open. And it did. We stepped into a cleaning closet and then out into the church. A priest named Father James was out there, and he saw us and came walking over. I was still crying. My ankle hurt so much, and we tried to tell him what had happened, but I'm sure we were talking too fast, and we were still too scared to get things out. He said he'd walk us home, and that we were now safe. When we got there, my mother got upset, and we told her what had happened, and she called the doctor for me and tried to get us to stop crying and calm down. She thanked Father James, and he left. The doctor came out and looked me over and said it was just a mild sprain and that I needed to stay off it. I'll always remember that he said I needed to play indoor games for a bit, and my mother saying she'd already made that decision for me. Daddy got home from work later, and my mother told him what had happened, and he got on her phone and told the person on the line that he needed to make an important call, and whoever it was got off right away. It's funny how I remember things like this. Does anybody listening to this remember party lines? Wow, I guess I am really old. Later that night, some of the men in our town came over and sat on the porch talking to my daddy, but my mother shooed Susie and I back inside. We sat in the living room playing with some puzzles and listened to the radio, when Susie got up to go to my room to get something out of her weekend bag. A minute or so later, she screamed, and Mother and Daddy came running in, looking at me, and I just said, "Susie, she went into my room." They went to my room in the back of the house, and Susie was crying and saying that the man was in the window when she went in there. Daddy pushed her over towards my mother, who held her with open arms, and then he ran back to the porch. All I heard was, "That son of a bitch is out here," and the sound of the men getting up and jumping off the porch. Daddy ran back in, got his shotgun with my mother saying, "Dan, wait!" but he was already back outside. The men were gone for a long time that evening, and Susie and I were in bed when they got back. I heard Daddy come in, start whispering to my mother about something, and they whispered back and forth for quite a little bit. And then I fell asleep. The next day, I begged my mother to let me go outside in the backyard and just sit in the sun rather than be inside, and she said okay if I promised not to be up on my ankle. I sat in a lawn chair, and Susie was making me laugh with a dance and song she had just made up to entertain me. Then she stopped and pointed to a box by the side of my house and asked, "What is that?" I said it was Daddy's burning box. We burned a lot of trash in a fire once a week in the warmer months. She went over to it and picked up a dirty shirt that had what I thought was red paint on it at the time, but later figured out what it really was. Susie then picked up something else, just a bit because it was heavy. It was the tent where we had run into the men the day before. I can't say for certain what happened that night, but I have a pretty good idea. I'm not saying that it's right, but I do know that we were protected by my daddy and my friends' daddies. We never said a word to my daddy or mother that we saw those things in the burning box, and we promised each other we'd never tell. Susie lives in California now and I don't see her that much, but I think she'd be okay with me telling you this story. That was a very scary time in my life, and I'm still scared telling it right now. Thanks for listening, gang. If you have a story you'd like to hear on this channel, send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment if you wish. The banter here is fun. And make sure to click on the notifications bell too. That'll let you know when new content is posted. I also have a Patreon page for those of you who would like to receive content early and see some videos that are not available here. For as little as $1 per month, you'll have access. Larger amounts mean more perks. Thanks to all of my new patrons, it's awesome to have you here. And don't forget, follow me on social media too. Links to my Patreon and those are in the description. I'm on vacation for a bit, but we'll be posting, so I hope you dig it. And until next time, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.